Hello everyone, and welcome to the Tome of Silver, the show where I randomly select a game from my collection, review it, and add it to an ever-growing ranking list. It's incredible how Fire Emblem used to be one of Nintendo's more niche titles back in the day, especially when you consider how much of a titan the franchise has become. I, like I imagine many others, was first introduced to Fire Emblem thanks to Marth and Roy being playable characters in Super Smash Bros. Melee. I wouldn't get into the series proper until several years later. A friend sold me their Game Boy Advance SP at a yard sale, alongside several games. One of these games is the subject of today's video, Fire Emblem. Despite not having any numbers or subtitles in its name, this was not the first game in the series. In fact, this was actually the 7th game in the franchise, its full title in Japan being Fire Emblem: The Blazing Blade. Fire Emblem was already a long-standing line of medieval strategy games, with its first title released in 1990 on the Nintendo Entertainment System. However, Nintendo never attempted to localize the series to other regions. But once Marth and Roy's presence in Super Smash Bros. Brought many curious eyes to the series, Nintendo believed there was enough interest to bring it over to the West. Since this was the first game in the franchise we'd received, Nintendo named it Fire Emblem, for better marketability to not scare off newcomers. I was torn as to whether I should cover this title or Fire Emblem: The Binding Blade, the 6th game in the series. It was never officially translated into English, but I own a translated cartridge for Fire Emblem 6, and I like tackling each series in order of release to better note how each subsequent game improves from its predecessors. However, as FE7 was both my and Western audiences' introduction to the series, I decided to start there. Plus, FE6 and FE7 are a duology, with 7 acting as a prequel to 6. So by playing in this order, we'll be able to experience both games as one continual story. We'll tackle Binding Blade next time. For today, arm yourself, head to the front lines, and let's turn the page to Fire Emblem for the Game Boy Advance. In the plains of Sakai, a wandering tactician, that's us, falls unconscious, presumably from exhaustion after a long journey. We are found by a young girl named Lynn, a nomad who recently lost her parents and tribe in a bandit attack. The two decide to travel together, as the tactician wishes to learn more about the ways of strategy, while Lynn wants to hone her skills and become stronger. During their travels, they meet with 2 knights of House Kalin, Kent and Sane. It's revealed that the Marquis of Kalin is Lynn's grandfather, and Lynn is the heir to the throne. However, her uncle, Lundgren, wishes to seize the throne for himself, which means Lynn is a direct obstacle to his rise to power. Though Lynn has no ambition to rule, she refuses to let a power-hungry man like Lundgren claim the throne. And so, Lynn begins her journey to Kalin, gathering allies and facing off against her uncle's forces, so that she may see her grandfather, the only family she has left. Lynn's story takes up the first 10 of the 30 chapters in Fire Emblem, and primarily serves as a tutorial for the game's mechanics. It's an effective guide to the various aspects of gameplay, dedicating 1 or 2 new mechanics to each chapter so as to not overwhelm the player. Though the game has plenty of elements that makes it challenging, which we'll discuss later, this tutorial makes FE7 very beginner-friendly. Plus, once you've completed the game for the first time, this tutorial can be skipped on subsequent playthroughs. This is certainly appreciated, as while it's a welcome inclusion for new players, it can be slow and a little too easy for veterans. There is a downside to skipping the tutorial though. The playable units in Lynn's story, such as Kent and Sane, return in chapters 11 through 30. If you skip the tutorial, the levels and stats will start lower than if you had leveled them up during Lynn's story. As such, if you want to make the most effective use of these particular units, you'll need to play through the tutorial anyway. Once we hit chapter 11, that's where the true story starts. We now switch perspectives to Eliwood, the Prince of House Foray. Eliwood is a kind-hearted man and a pacifist, often seeking a peaceful solution before jumping to battle. He's searching for his father, Lord Elbert, who has gone missing. Joining him is Hector, Eliwood's best friend and a noble of House Ostia, not to mention one of the best lords in the series. Hector is a bold man, recklessly jumping into battle and typically speaking his mind without much concern for decorum or his station as a noble. As the pair travel, they learn of Lord Elbert's involvement with a group known as the Black Fang. The Black Fang are a band of assassins who have begun to spread their influence across the land for some unknown purpose. What starts as a simple search soon turns into a war to save the world. FE7's story was enjoyable, but I wouldn't say anything about it blew me away. In an era where most Fire Emblem games have more fantastical plots, it is refreshing to step back to a time when the series had a greater focus on politics and relationships between kingdoms. It gives a more grounded narrative than expected, while still having fantasy elements such as magic and dragons. If the likes of Fire Emblem Engage or Fates put you off with their more outlandish storytelling, you may find FE7 more appealing. I found including the player as a tactician within the game's story relatively weak. The tactician adds very little to the plot, acting just as a reason why Eliwood's army is so cohesive, but that didn't need an answer to begin with. I regularly forgot the tactician was even a thing, until one of the random instances where one of the lords addressed me directly, facing the screen and talking to me like I'm watching an episode of Dora the Explorer. The strongest aspect of Fire Emblem's writing was its characters, as FE7 has one of the most likable casts in the series. Usually I would find a purely heroic character like Eliwood a bit boring, but as part of the trio of himself, Hector, and Lyn, he's excellent. He brings a level head to the group, which nicely balances out Hector and Lyn's more brash personalities. His dynamic with the other lords makes for an entertaining team of protagonists. Whereas later games have far more dynamic and archetypal personalities for their characters, the characterization in FE7 is more subtle, making the cast feel much more realistic and down to earth. This game has my favorite character in the entire franchise too, Nino. Nino is just the sweetest girl with such a compelling character arc. I love her. The only issue is that as great as the supporting cast is, this series' famous permadeath mechanic, which we'll discuss more later, means many of them get pushed to the wayside. Since a large portion of the cast can either die or not be recruited based on the player's actions, the story has to assume you may not have a particular character in your army, and thus that character can't play a pivotal role in the plot. Urk was an early favorite of mine, with his constant exasperation and sarcastic quips to his outgoing employer, Sarah. Several lines from him gave me some laughs, and I was disappointed that he basically stopped talking altogether once he permanently joined the army. The only way I could get more interactions from him was with the support mechanic, but that had its own problems. During gameplay, if two compatible units end their turn adjacent to each other, their support points will increase. Once they have enough support points, those characters can engage in a support conversation. Supports give the characters a buff when fighting within range of each other, and do much of the heavy lifting and highlighting the side characters, providing either humorous or insightful conversations between the many cast members. Achieving these conversations is rare unless you're actively grinding for them. You're unlikely to get many naturally during gameplay. I only saw one during my entire playthrough, and I'm pretty sure that one was mandatory, but that's my fault since I didn't actively go for them. What's the game's fault is that each character is locked to 5 support conversations total in a given playthrough. Each unit has roughly 7 characters they are compatible with, and each compatible pair will have 2 to 3 support conversations each. So the player is limited to a maximum of 5 out of the roughly 35 possible support conversations for each character. That sucks, plain and simple. These are the limited moments the supporting cast gets some time in the limelight. And the writing on display here is nothing short of stellar too. Restricting support so heavily like this is such a disappointment. That said, if you're only here for the gameplay, this likely won't bother you, and the gameplay of FE7 is fantastic. Fire Emblem is a tactical role-playing game, where players move their army on a grid-like map, not unlike a chessboard, with the goal usually being to defeat a boss character, defeat all enemies in the area, or survive a certain number of turns. Every unit is assigned a class, each with distinct advantages and disadvantages. For example, knights have great defense, making them ideal for absorbing weapon damage. However, they are in turn very vulnerable to magic. Meanwhile, something like a Pegasus Knight takes minor damage from magic, but bonus damage from bows. The weapon the unit wields is essential as well. Fire Emblem has what's known as the weapon triangle, where swords are strong against axes, axes are strong against lances, and lances are strong against swords. Having a balanced army composition is critical to handling whatever obstacle the game throws your way, while also being careful where you place each unit, lest they get annihilated by their weakness. When a character defeats another unit, they'll earn experience and level up. unlike most RPGs, the stats raised from leveling up are random. For example, Elliewood has an 80% chance to gain an additional point in HP, but only a 30% chance to get a boost in defense. It's possible for every stat to go up when reaching a new level, but only a boost to a single stat is guaranteed. Sometimes you'll get a boost to 4 stats, other times you'll only get 1. It's entirely up to luck. I simultaneously love and hate this idea. On one hand, this provides a significant amount of replayability. Because a unit's growths are random, this can lead to units you may not have initially used becoming far more potent than they did on a previous playthrough, encouraging you to give them a try the second go around. Additionally, even if you use the same unit in multiple playthroughs, their stats are unlikely to be identical, and thus may need to be utilized differently. On the other hand, the fact it's dependent on pure luck does bother me. The player may get bad luck on every level up, causing a unit to fall behind and become unviable. This can be a bummer if you're fond of a particular unit, but they've fallen behind so much that they no longer deal enough damage or constantly die in a single hit. And trust me, you don't want your unit's HP to hit 0. If they do, that unit is gone forever. They won't return after you complete a level, and there's no way to revive them after the fact. A dead unit stays dead unless they're one of the 3 main lords, in which case it's an immediate game over. This gives the player a hard choice when they lose a unit. They can either restart the stage, or take the loss and move on if they're near the end of a particularly challenging chapter. Personally, I could never stomach losing a character, especially since I put time and possibly resources into raising them. For me, losing any unit may as well be a game over. However, a risk of a permanent loss to your army gives substantial weight to each choice you make, requiring careful decision making and discouraging reckless moves. Some players even decide to do Iron Man runs, where they must continue when a unit dies, and a game over is the end of the run. I'm too much of a coward to try one of these myself, but these can be really fun for those looking for a challenge and to test their strategy. Though even the best strategy fails in the face of Lady Luck. It's not just your stats that are up to chance, but also your hit percentage. Each character has a certain percentage chance of hitting an enemy, which is heavily dependent on a weapon's advantage and stats. I immensely enjoyed this element of luck here actually, as it added a particular spice to each encounter. There's a certain feeling of elation when your unit manages to pull through and hit an enemy with low odds, and a twinge of nervousness when an enemy lands a hit that is just unlikely. Of course, there'll be moments when your plan will be thrown out the window or need to be adjusted when one of your units misses an attack they really shouldn't have. There's also no discounting the incredible feeling when your unit lands a 5% critical hit, or the fear of God when the enemy does the same. In terms of difficulty, I found FE7 to be comfortable. Some maps challenged me to be certain, but I found that I could make it through a stage just fine, so long as I wasn't overly reckless or unlucky. Where Fire Emblem's real challenge comes in is from how much the game commits you to each action you take. There's the previously discussed permadeath, but certain stages also have powerful items in chests in far-off reaches of the map, which you'll need to decide if it's worth going for. Not getting these treasures makes the stage easier, but deprives you of handy items you may need later down the line. Shops to buy equipment are limited to certain levels, and there's no way to purchase items otherwise. Weapons in Fire Emblem break after a certain amount of uses. Not going to shops or even not having enough gold because you never got more from the aforementioned treasure chests means you may lack the necessary equipment for later levels. Finally, rushing levels to complete the objective as quickly as possible while avoiding most other enemies can deprive you of experience for your characters to level up. There's no way to replay levels or otherwise grind for experience, so if you're avoiding fighting or only letting one of your units take all the experience for themselves, you'll find yourself with a weak army that will struggle in later levels. I found this to be brilliant. Fire Emblem is constantly providing you with choices that seem small at first, but continually making the wrong ones can start to add up, fundamentally changing the difficulty of the game based on the player's decisions. It asks the player to consider not just the battle in front of them, but also the battles to come, adding a layer of depth to how I needed to approach each stage. Ultimately, Fire Emblem becomes as easy or difficult as the player chooses to make it, providing different challenges on each playthrough, only adding to the game's incredible replayability. Even if you found the main story to be a bit on the easier side, Upon finishing the game for the first time, you'll unlock the hard difficulty, as well as Hector mode, which is a more difficult campaign where we play from the perspective of Hector instead of Eliwood, which even has a handful of exclusive characters and chapters. Once you beat Hector mode, you'll then unlock Hector hard mode, the game's hardest challenge. So if the player wants to get more out of the game, these 3 additional modes can quadruple Fire Emblem's roughly 30-hour playtime. The last thing to talk about is the presentation, and as I'm sure you've seen throughout this review, Fire Emblem has a phenomenal art style. The dialogue portraits are wonderfully detailed, and is it weird that I'm just blown away that they actually took the time to animate the characters blinking? In-battle sprites also look great, selling the impact of each attack. Landing a critical hit especially is immensely satisfying. Your character gets an extra animation before unleashing a devastating attack, causing the whole screen to shake with the sound of sparks. It's incredible. It makes me feel like I wiped out not just the enemy, but their entire bloodline. Of course, the music is also excellent, providing a varied soundtrack with music I wouldn't have thought the Game Boy capable of producing. This is some of the best visuals and sound the Game Boy Advance can offer, and there is no underselling that. Fire Emblem for the Game Boy Advance is a phenomenal title. It's a perfectly solid story that contains a brilliant cast of characters. Its game mechanics are among the best in its genre, offering a flexible difficulty depending on the player's decision making, while providing even greater challenges for those yearning for more after the first playthrough. Fire Emblem is a title that has something to offer to both newcomers and veterans alike, and the replayability of its modes and characters can keep players interested for a long while. Fire Emblem will claim the number 12 spot, removing our previous Fire Emblem title, Tokyo Mirage Sessions, from its place. For the first Fire Emblem officially brought to Western regions, FE7 was undoubtedly a great entry to start the onboarding process. If you're looking for a great strategy game, or just a Fire Emblem fan looking to give one of the pre-Awakening titles a try, I give FE7 a ringing endorsement. And that's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a like, as it helps push this channel a little higher in the hellscape which is the YouTube algorithm. For all my fellow Fire Emblem fans, what's your favorite title in this series? I'd also love to hear who everyone's favorite unit is in FE7, both in terms of gameplay and personality. As I said, my favorite character was Nino. She is just such a precious little cinnamon roll, and her stats can become insane if you invest some time into leveling her up. Share your favorite down in the comments. Remember to stay to the end of the video to see which game our wheel will select next. In the meantime, thank you all so much for watching. Take care, and may we see each other again when we turn to the next chapter in the Tome of Silver.